All right, so here we are. We only have a little bit left. Let's review period 9. Period 9 goes from about the 1980s to present day. As you can see, only 5% of the exam will cover this content, this time period, so really don't freak out too much about this. A lot of teachers even stop at teaching Ronald Reagan. So, speaking of Ronald Reagan, let's talk about the rise of conservatism. Last time, at the end of the period 8 review, we had mentioned the rise of liberalism. Okay, and liberals typically are your Democrats. They support things like social welfare programs, etc. Now, conservatives are usually the opposite. They don't support social welfare. They're more fundamentalists, more strict interpretation of the Bible, if you will. They oppose things like abortion, gay marriage, etc. Now, the reason the conservatives are rising again in the 1980s, the reason Ronald Reagan is around, is because of two reasons. One, Jimmy Carter's failure with the Iran hostage crisis, and also the growing distrust of the government with the Vietnam era. So people, as almost a last resort, go back to the conservatives to try to see if Ronald Reagan can save the day. Well, he does kind of save the day for our economy, at least. He does bring the economy back into relevant conversation because of his what we call Reaganomics or supply side economics, which is exactly the same as Hoover. Remember him from the 20s? His trickle down theory, where you cut taxes for the rich and that money will trickle down to us working class people by the business owners opening up more jobs and raising wages. Okay, so he also, Reagan saves the day when it comes to the Cold War. He does bring an end to the Cold War through his policies that we'll talk about in a second. Things that kind of were a loss for the Reagan administration was that although he is conservative, and they usually do like smaller government, the government size did grow. So bureaucracy increased, if you will, because of things like Social Security and Medicare, etc. And like we said before, where conservatives are usually against abortion, the Roe versus Wade case that was mentioned in last review, period 8, okay, is still going to hold merit even to this day. So Roe versus Wade, even though it's still brought up to this day, it is still the rule that we follow when it comes to abortion. Now, as far as the Cold War that I mentioned earlier, um, Reagan really prided himself on being what we call a Cold Warrior, which means someone that was very against communism and really hell bent on trying to destroy the Soviet Union. There's a rhetoric versus reality there. The rhetoric was, like I said, he prided himself on being this hardcore anti-communist and trying to destroy the evil empire and etc. But in reality, he kind of was homies with Gorbachev, and Gorbachev and him did talk a lot, and Gorbachev really pleaded with Reagan a lot to try to let some things slide, especially when it came to like the SDI program, the Strategic Defense Initiative, building that shield and satellite in space to deflect nuclear bombs, etc. Gorbachev really pleaded with Reagan to not create that because he knew that if the Soviets were trying to compete with that they would go bankrupt. Well, in the end, we know they do, and so that's going to cause one of the big downfalls of the Soviet Union. Since the Reagan years, what are some foreign policy challenges? 9/11 is probably the biggest foreign policy challenge. The September 11th attacks on, the four planes that were hijacked by terrorists. Two were flown into the World Trade Center. One was to the Pentagon, and one was went down to Camp David. The guy behind all these terrorist attacks, okay, was the guy Osama bin Laden, the same guy that we gave money and weapons to in the invasion of Afghanistan when the Soviets did that in 1979. This is really the beginning of the war on terror. Terrorism has become part of our vocabulary since then, unfortunately. And afterwards, okay, George W. Bush will invade Afghanistan to find Osama bin Laden. It takes us a few years, but we do eventually find him. Speaking of George W. Bush, he also has another war on his hands, okay, just like his dad had issues with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Iraq had threatened the United States with weapons of mass destruction, and George W. Bush says, no, we can't have that. So we do invade Iraq. We call this the Second Persian Gulf War. We find nothing, and in the end, okay, Saddam Hussein eventually also will be found years later and put on quote-unquote trial and convicted. Last thing there on the bottom, concerns over the violations of the Patriot Act. Since 9/11, the Patriot Act was passed, which basically says the government can monitor us as civilians and keep, some tabs on us by reading our emails and text messages and things like that. It still goes on to this day. Some people say that's against, my civil liberties. You're limiting them too much. That's not cool. And some people say, well, you know what? It's for national security, so I'm okay with that. All right, last things. Let's wrap this up. Changes since the 1970s. Immigration has since changed. We've opened the doors to immigrants since the Lyndon Johnson administration, as we talked about. Government spending has continued to increase in things like health, in the fields of healthcare and social security, and government surveillance. A lot of jobs have gone overseas. A lot of presidents have vowed to bring those jobs back. Companies go overseas because it's less money for them. They don't have to pay workers as much. There are global challenges with global warming and climate change. Those have since come to national attention since, Teddy Roosevelt and the Sierra Club. All right. Other than that, though, that is period 9 in a nutshell. There's not that much to know, but hopefully this helps. If you found that this did help, give it a like or subscribe. Have a wonderful day.